The hospital doors slammed shut behind her as if they were trying to erase her from the place she had spent 12 years serving. Abigail Carter stood on the sidewalk in the cold evening rain, clutching a cardboard box filled with the few belongings she had been allowed to take. Inside were a worn photograph of her late mother, a small wooden cross, 2 pens, and a handwritten note from a child she had once cared for. Her hands were trembling, but she refused to cry. What the hospital executives had done to her hurt deeply, but what frightened her was what she had discovered during her final shift. Someone inside that hospital was deliberately putting patients in danger, and Abigail knew that if she stayed silent, innocent people might die. Before we continue, if you believe kindness, courage, and second chances can change someone's life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the greatest courage. Abigail had never been the kind of nurse who demanded attention. At Mercy Harbor Medical Center in Norfolk, Virginia, she was known for remembering patients' names, bringing frightened children small paper stars, and sitting beside elderly patients when their families could not arrive in time. Her colleagues sometimes joked that Abigail had a sixth sense for suffering. She could walk into a room and immediately know when something was wrong, even if the monitors appeared normal. Her greatest strength was not a medical degree or a special title. It was the simple belief that every person lying in a hospital bed was someone's mother, someone's father, someone's child, or someone's entire world. For years, that belief had made her respected by patients but increasingly inconvenient to the hospital administration. Mercy Harbor had recently changed leadership, and the new executives cared more about numbers than people. Nurses were pressured to work longer shifts with fewer staff. Supplies disappeared from storage. Experienced nurses were replaced with temporary workers. Abigail noticed something even more disturbing: medication records were being changed after patients received treatment. At first, she assumed the mistakes were administrative. Then she began seeing a pattern. A patient would receive one medication, but the electronic chart would later show another. Dosages were altered. Times were changed. Nurses who questioned the discrepancies were suddenly transferred to other departments or quietly encouraged to resign. Abigail started documenting everything. She kept copies of official records, wrote down dates, and recorded the names of witnesses. She did not know who was responsible, but she knew something was seriously wrong. Then, 3 weeks before she was fired, a young Navy veteran named Caleb Morgan arrived at Mercy Harbor after collapsing during training. He was 29 years old and had served overseas with a Navy Special Operations Unit. He was unconscious when Abigail first saw him. His vital signs were unstable, and his chart showed that a particular medication had already been administered. But Abigail immediately noticed something strange. The dosage recorded in the computer did not match the empty vial beside the bed. She checked the medication cabinet. The same medication had been signed out twice. Abigail's stomach tightened. She reported the discrepancy to her supervisor, Rebecca Collins, a senior administrator who had once been a nurse herself. Rebecca listened quietly and then told Abigail that she was imagining patterns where none existed. She warned her not to create unnecessary trouble. Abigail tried to explain that she was not accusing anyone, but Rebecca became colder and told her to forget about it. Abigail could not forget. 2 nights later, another patient suffered a dangerous reaction after receiving medication that was supposedly unrelated to his condition. Abigail recognized the same documentation pattern. Once again, the electronic record had been changed after the medication was administered. She began to suspect that someone was deliberately manipulating patient records to hide improper medication practices. And then Abigail found the name connected to every suspicious entry. It belonged to a senior hospital executive named Gregory Wallace. Gregory controlled purchasing, staffing approvals, and several internal compliance systems. He was respected by the hospital board and feared by employees. He had a reputation for making problems disappear. Abigail knew she was standing against someone powerful. Still, she kept collecting evidence. One afternoon, She was called into an executive conference room. Gregory was there with Rebecca and 2 hospital attorneys. The room felt strangely quiet. Abigail immediately knew this was not a routine meeting. Gregory placed a folder on the table and told Abigail that her employment was being terminated for violating hospital policy, accessing restricted records, and creating unnecessary concern among staff. Abigail stared at him in disbelief. She knew exactly what this was. They were not firing her because she had broken rules. They were firing her because she had discovered something they wanted buried. She tried to explain that the records she accessed concerned patients under her direct care. She tried to show them her documentation. But Gregory refused to look. He told her that security would escort her out. Abigail felt something inside her break. Not because she was losing her job. Because she knew what might happen next. If the person manipulating the records remained inside the hospital, another patient could become a victim. She packed her box without saying another word. Rain was falling when she stepped outside. She sat on a bench near the hospital parking lot and stared at the cardboard box resting beside her. For 12 years, Mercy Harbor had been more than a workplace. It had been where she had watched people recover, where she had held the hands of dying patients, where she had learned to celebrate tiny victories. Now she was being treated as though she had never mattered. Her eyes filled with tears. Then she noticed the wooden cross inside her box. Her mother had given it to her when Abigail became a nurse. Her mother had always told her that courage did not mean being unafraid. It meant doing what was right while afraid. Abigail wiped her face. Then she remembered something Caleb Morgan had told her before losing consciousness. His unit had a medical liaison who could be contacted if a service member's treatment was compromised. Abigail had never intended to use that number. But now she made the call. The person on the other end listened carefully as Abigail explained what had happened. She provided dates, medication records, patient information, and the evidence she had collected. She expected questions. Instead, the response was calm and immediate. The liaison told her that Caleb Morgan's case had been flagged internally because his medical records were connected to an ongoing military review. If Abigail's information was accurate, the situation was far more serious than a hospital staffing dispute. Abigail was asked to remain available. She agreed. What she did not know was that the call triggered a chain of events that would change Mercy Harbor forever. Less than an hour later, several black vehicles entered the hospital parking area. Inside the emergency department, nurses noticed men in dark clothing moving through the building. They were not ordinary security officers. Their posture, discipline, and quiet confidence made everyone understand that something unusual was happening. A small team of Navy SEALs had arrived to check on Caleb Morgan and protect the integrity of his medical case. Leading them was Lieutenant Commander Nathaniel Brooks, a veteran officer with years of operational experience. He did not enter the hospital shouting or making threats. He simply walked through the doors with the calm expression of someone who had learned that the most dangerous moments were often the quiet ones. Gregory Wallace was informed that military personnel were requesting access to Caleb's medical records. His confidence disappeared. He immediately contacted hospital security. But before security could intervene, federal investigators arrived with legal authorization to review the records associated with Caleb's treatment. Abigail was brought back into the hospital. This time, she did not enter carrying a cardboard box. She entered carrying evidence. The same people who had watched her leave in humiliation now watched her return beside investigators. Rebecca Collins looked ashamed. Gregory looked furious. But Abigail remained calm. The investigation revealed something even larger than she had suspected. Medication entries had been altered in dozens of patient records. Certain expensive medications had been ordered and billed to insurance companies but were not always administered. Some supplies had been diverted through a network of outside vendors connected to people working with Gregory. The hospital had not merely been hiding mistakes. People had been making money while patients were placed at risk. The evidence Abigail had collected became one of the most important pieces of the investigation because she had preserved original notes, timestamps, medication logs, and witness accounts before the records could be altered again. But the investigation also uncovered something deeply painful. One of the patients whose medication records had been manipulated had died months earlier. His name was Samuel Price. He had been an elderly father whose daughter had visited him every evening. Abigail remembered him. She remembered the way he smiled whenever his daughter entered the room. She remembered how he used to tell her that nurses were angels who worked without wings. When Abigail learned that Samuel's death was now being reviewed, she sat alone in the hospital chapel and cried. She could not stop thinking about him. She wished she had known sooner. She wished she had been able to protect him. Nathaniel Brooks found her there. He did not offer empty words. He simply sat several seats away. After a long silence, Abigail admitted that she felt guilty. She had done everything she could, but it still felt like it was not enough. Nathaniel reminded her that courage was not measured by how many battles a person won. Sometimes it was measured by whether they were willing to stand up after being knocked down. Abigail looked at the small wooden cross in her hands. For the first time since being fired, she allowed herself to breathe. Weeks passed. The investigation continued. Gregory Wallace was removed from his position, and several employees were placed under investigation. Mercy Harbor's board brought in an independent oversight team. Policies were rewritten. Medication tracking systems were audited. Nurses were encouraged to report concerns without fear of retaliation. But the biggest change happened among the staff. People began speaking again. Nurses who had been afraid for years finally shared what they had witnessed. Former employees came forward. Patients' families were contacted. The hospital started acknowledging the harm caused by its failures. And Abigail? She was offered her old job back. But she refused. She had spent 12 years believing that being a good nurse meant simply taking care of patients one room at a time. Now she understood that sometimes protecting patients meant standing up against the system itself. Instead, Abigail accepted a new position with an independent patient safety organization. Her first assignment was to train nurses on recognizing documentation irregularities, medication discrepancies, and unsafe institutional practices. 1 year later, Abigail returned to Mercy Harbor for a ceremony honoring nurses who had demonstrated extraordinary courage. She stood in the same lobby where she had once been fired. But this time, the hospital staff applauded. Caleb Morgan was there too. He had recovered and returned to active duty. He walked toward Abigail wearing his dress uniform and stopped in front of her. He thanked her for making the phone call that had changed everything. Abigail smiled and told him that she had simply done what any nurse should do. But Caleb shook his head. He told her that many people see something wrong and hope someone else will fix it. She had chosen to act. That difference had saved lives. Abigail looked around the crowded hospital lobby. She saw nurses, doctors, veterans, patients, families, and people who had once doubted her. She thought about the rainy night when she had walked out carrying a cardboard box. At the time, she believed she had lost everything. Now she understood something she wished she had known then. Sometimes a door closes because you are being pushed toward a door you were never brave enough to open yourself. Abigail never became famous. She never asked for a medal. She never wanted revenge. She simply wanted patients to be safe. And perhaps that was why her story touched so many people. Because she had been hurt, humiliated, and pushed aside. Yet she chose not to become bitter. She chose to become stronger. Years later, whenever a young nurse asked Abigail what she had learned from the experience, she always gave the same answer: never confuse silence with peace, never confuse authority with truth, and never underestimate what one ordinary person can accomplish when they refuse to abandon what is right. If this story touched your heart, please support the video with a like, share it with someone who believes in courage and kindness, and subscribe for more emotional stories of hope, sacrifice, and second chances. And before we end, I want you to leave one special comment. Courage begins when we refuse to stay silent. Because Abigail Carter's story was never really about getting fired. It was about what happened after. It was about a nurse who lost her position but found her voice, a veteran whose life became the turning point in a much larger fight, and a hospital that learned the hardest lesson of all: you can silence one employee, but you cannot silence the truth forever. Sometimes the person you push out the door is the very person who saves everyone inside. And sometimes, one phone call is all it takes to make the truth impossible to ignore.